Jodie Whittaker's run in Doctor Who was certainly one of its time, so to speak. Chris Chibnall had taken over from Stephen Moffat and had to cast the first female Doctor, and the series opener had an all-time high for people who came to view this story with a peak interest in the new female Doctor. Today is Doctor Who Sunday, and we are going to take a look at a Jodie Whittaker story, Arachnids in the UK. Hello and welcome back to Chat About It, Don't Shout About It with me, Rachel, the Queen of the Woke, as crowned by one of my haters. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe to the channel, switch on the notification bells so that you know I am releasing another video. Thank you to everyone who has joined me already. I cannot run this channel without you. I release a new poll every Sunday where you can choose which story that it is that you would like talked about on a Sunday. Jodie Whittaker is the only one who doesn't get a poll because not enough people vote on her polls in order to justify doing one for her. And believe me, I tried. However, I thought with the series round-off that we did last week, let's have a look at another Whittaker story before going into next week, where we perhaps might look at a classic for a bit of a refresher. I am doing Jodie's stories in order. The playlist will be linked at the end where you can find the other three that I have reviewed already. Please do keep it friendly in the chat, and please do remember that it is okay to like this Doctor and that we can have differences in opinion, and I do encourage those in the chat. Arachnids in the UK was written by Chris Chibnall. It was directed by Sally Abrahamian. I think I've said that correctly. And it aired on the 28th of October 2018, and 8.22 million, and yes, that is the correct figure, people watched in consolidation. So the Doctor and Yaz and Graham and Ryan manage to get back home. The Doctor joins Yaz at her family's house for a cup of tea. Graham decides to go home, leaving Yaz and Ryan to go with the Doctor. It has only been 30 minutes since they left in their first story, The Woman Who Fell to Earth. Yaz gets a call from her mother, who had been at a new job working for a man named Robertson in a hotel. She had been fired almost immediately, so Yaz goes to collect her. Whilst waiting for Yaz to return, the Doctor offers to go and collect a parcel from a neighbour. She and Ryan go to collect it, only to meet Dr. McIntyre outside. Dr. McIntyre is trying to get hold of her work colleague who lives inside the apartment but is unable to. The sonic screwdriver is used to break in, and they discover that the apartment is covered in cobwebs. In there, they meet a spider that is very big, well, quite big in comparison to normal everyday spiders. And they also discover that Dr. McIntyre was not surprised by the cobwebs, and that she was actually looking for her work colleague who had been cocooned inside a web. At the hotel, Yaz meets her mother, and slowly and surely they also discover that there is a giant spider living at that hotel. The Doctor arrived at that hotel with Graham and Ryan because Graham had also discovered a giant spider inside his house. Dr. McIntyre is also working with them and was trying to work out how to get the spiders under control. The Doctor discovered that the carcasses of the spiders that Dr. McIntyre had been experimenting on had been collected by a company that had been dumped into an empty coal mine, which is what the hotel was built on top of, and it is now full of toxic waste. The spiders had grown very big and they were dangerous, and it becomes a race against time in this story of cowardice to destroy these spiders. All right, so this review isn't going to be too long because this story, well, it's quite a weak story. Out of the first four that I watched, I think Rosa is definitely my favorite, even though there are issues with it. By the way, this is the second time that I am watching Jodie's stories through. I've only ever watched them all once, but there's a lot of exposition in this one. Now, the exposition is surrounded by good points and it's surrounded by bad points. So please leave your comments below as to what you think of this story. I will say, if you compare this to anything that we had in the recent two series, in my opinion, this is heaps better because this story, well, it plays into fear, doesn't it? With the arachnids, the spiders. And that is a phobia that a lot of people have in real life. Arachnophobia. When I was a child, I suffered from arachnophobia very badly. It's not as bad now. It's just as bad as the mannequins. However, I am able to sit through something like this and watch spiders coming to get you without freaking out too much. I certainly struggled a lot less than perhaps what I would have done with the autons. Now, these spiders aren't really all that scary, and I think that is to do with the CGI. All practicality has been lost. I don't really go and watch how they make these particular stories. I'm not necessarily interested in that, never have been. The reason for this is because I prefer to remain unspoiled. I don't know how much animatronics or life size models they worked with for these particular spiders, but I think when you involve more practicality, it is more scary. And I think when you use CGI, it gets taken away. And yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think what I'm trying to say is you can clearly see that they are CGI. If I was watching this as a child, then I think I would be totally engrossed with that and terrified. But watching it as an adult, well, the fear factor isn't there all that much, in my opinion. These creatures being done in a CGI format, especially the bigger they are, the more likely they are to be CGI. They even focused on the animated smaller ones as well. I think that had this been classic Who, they would have focused on the practicalities a lot more because they didn't have the resources. And they probably could have done it here as well, especially with the smaller ones. They could have made something that seemed a lot more realistic than perhaps what we got. We got that with Donna Noble with the Trickster in Turn Left, didn't we? It was quite a practical effect, that one was. However, they choose to do it the way that they chose to do it, and that's fine. That's up to them, and it's okay if you like it as well. I just think that there could have been more that they could have done with it, and that wasn't necessarily associated with CGI. That being said, they are not terrible. They really aren't. The concept behind them is very good, and I think that they could have tapped into the more of the psychological aspect with these spiders because obviously it costs a lot of money to make CGI spiders, especially giant ones. They did try to tap into the psychology, and what I mean is you see something that's not quite there. Well, let's get into it. The opening that we get with the dark flashing lights on this hotel is quite a good opening, and I do wish that they had played into that more rather than going into the exposition. I think the exposition in that let it down a little bit. I know that we've got to set up the character of Robertson because he is a total coward, typical white man coward, but we've got to highlight him in his worst possible state and most unlikable state before we make him a scapegoat for cowardice. Every good point that I'm going to make about this particular story, by the way, is something that I feel like they could have taken a lot further. I know that is the biggest downfall, is the length of the story as well. 49 minutes for this story is not enough time to put the fear factor in anything. One of my favourite bits, so now we're getting back to the spiders, even though I don't really like spiders, is when Ryan barricades the spider into a room very early on in the story. The next thing that we see is the spider legs, or the tips of the spider legs, come through the door. It's almost like it's a shadow, and don't you ever get that feeling, especially when you've got something like arachnophobia, or you're not too keen on spiders, but it's not quite a phobia, that you see something wiggle with the tips of its legs out of the corner of your eye, or you can see it sort of under the door. That little thing that they did with Ryan in that scene, that plays into part of that phobia. That was fantastic. And I think that they could have really played into that so much more. It was such a missed opportunity. Just a fun little side story. My parents' dog, the family dog Monty. He used to capture spiders and he would play with them until they were dead. But he would also pick them up when they were alive and walk around with them and in his mouth, and their little legs would be wiggling like that out of his mouth. It was absolutely disgusting and it was horrible to look at. And one of the most common aspects of the phobia of spiders is how they move. I think that's where my dislike for them stems from. M- Now, most of my good points in this story tend to involve the spiders, actually, I will say. So, the cobwebs, we get a lot of cobwebs in this story, and this is something that I wish that they continued all the way throughout consistently, much like how dark the opening was. I wish that darkness had continued throughout the story. I wish the fear factors of the spiders playing the psychological aspect of our phobias was also played throughout the story. I wish they had continued with this business of the spider webs as well throughout the entirety of the story. There's nothing more terrifying or nothing like a worse feeling than walking into a sea of spider webs unintentionally. I don't even know if it's called that, but I'm calling it that. This is something that they could have done, but unfortunately, they didn't play into that aspect because there was a lot of talking going on in this story. And whilst I don't mind the exposition, I think in most circumstances, particularly with a story like this, you need to get away from that exposition as quickly as you possibly can. The story needs to be the phobia, especially because it's such a common phobia. I like it when Doctor Who gets you hiding behind your pillow, in addition to the historical aspects of Doctor Who. I think the exposition in this kind of contrives the Doctor a little bit because she doesn't really do much in this story. There isn't much of a payoff for her like there were in her first two stories, The Woman Who Fell to Earth and The Ghost Monument. Rose is a little bit debatable. Now, I am very much adamant that Jodie Whittaker was miscast as the Doctor, but I will give her a fair review. However, because they were focusing on a cowardice of a man, it didn't really allow for her to do what the Doctor should do. The Doctor thing that the Doctor does. The cowardice of Robertson kind of overtakes the story quite a fair bit, so much so that the focus is more about him talking, more about talking down to him and not allowing the Doctor to figure it out for herself. And I think that's because of the cowardice, and that's what makes the resolution so, well, lackluster. Robertson has his own emergency bunker in the hotel. Now, I've never heard of that before. I don't know if that kind of thing exists in a hotel, to be honest, and I'm not going to find out. However, due to that, it allows for Ryan, shockingly, to figure out how to lure the spiders into the bunker in order to suffocate them. Now, that is something that I would say is a plus. They didn't make Ryan to be a complete and total absolute dunderhead in this story. They gave him some time to figure it out, which is good. They gave Tosin Cole something to do other than acting stupid. And whilst I don't necessarily think him figuring it out, as opposed to the Doctor figuring out how to lure them in, was the best idea, that type of thing, it was nice to see him getting somewhat of a decent storyline. We had a fair chunk of spider education in this particular story, at least I think it was. And one of the things that they said was that spiders move towards sound. I don't know if that's true. It's most likely true, but that was the answer to luring the smaller spiders into the emergency bunker, and it was a bit underwhelming, to be quite frank with you. And when the Doctor goes to take down the big spider, that big spider, well, it's already suffocating because it's outgrown the space that it was in. And it just ends up getting shot by Robertson anyway because he freaks out, doesn't he? I would have liked to have it happen for Jodie's Doctor to let rip into that politician Robertson after that. It was something that we would quite often see the Doctor do, especially when he gets on his high ground about his morals and integrity, especially around using weapons. That didn't really happen here. Chibs had a really good opportune moment to do that, and he didn't take it. I think that is something that he does all the way throughout this entire story. He had so many opportune moments in this, but he just didn't take them, especially with the spiders. By the way, I did forget to mention that the giant spider's bathtub sequence was really good. I really enjoyed that bit. So the humans also being stored as cocoons was a fantastic idea. This obviously plays into how spiders treat their prey anyway in real life. I'm not a spider expert though, so I don't really know, but I think we could have played into that a lot more as well. I think this story really needed a bigger cast, because I think the story, you could afford to bump people off and get them taken by the spiders and put into cocoons. And YouTube, I'm just talking metaphorically here, by the way. And the fact that the hotel is built on an old coal mine that has land filled with lots of toxic waste, well, that's a great idea. And at one point, we go into that area. There could have been a massive sequence dedicated to that area. But because there was so much exposition going on, we don't really get to see it, which is unfortunate. We should be able to see the spiders mutating, because that's where the spiders are taken to, are taken to after they are made waste, aren't they? Chibs could have really afforded to have taken it there. But the reason why we didn't, in my opinion, get it is because it's all down to the exposition. It all keeps coming back to the exposition and the focus being put elsewhere. So, for example, establishing Jodie's doctor. Now, technically, by this point, she is already established, but I feel like he forgot that she was already established by this point and made her chaotic, particularly at the beginning. Like, for example, why would the doctor not know who Ed Sheeran is? And the fact that the doctor was just making random comments left, right, and centre. I understand that Jodie herself is quite energetic, but I feel like Chibs, has taken that and rolled with it and made it too much in this particular story, especially at the beginning. Now, they don't film these stories in order either. It could be that this one was done earlier. So maybe at that point, Jodie hadn't decided where she was going with the character. The thing about the Jodie Doctor is that the writing for her Doctor still kind of sounds like the Doctor. They didn't really feminize it, and it's still very clear that she is an alien and she is trying to sound intelligent at least. However, I felt like they were trying to make her weird by adding random, strange phrases in there that didn't really need to be in there, or how she changes conversation or throws a random sentence in for no reason whatsoever. It's almost like they were trying to make her something that she was not, while still sounding doctorish, I guess you could say. There is, though, one bit at the end which I felt was very fitting. And I think this is the first time that I've said this about the Jodie Doctor. And don't hold too much in store as to whether or not I will say it again. Mind you, I also did say last season that when Jodie appeared in the regeneration story, I was relieved, okay? There was a bit at the end where Yaz, Graham, and Ryan all decide that they are going to go travelling with the Doctor officially this time, to which the Doctor is very excited about, naturally. However, the Doctor in that moment does not make a promise. And that's very key. We quite often see the shooty Doctor making promises that he cannot keep. So she doesn't promise that they will be safe, and she asks them to be sure. And I feel like that is within the character of the Doctor to do that. And it was quite nice, because we don't always get that with the Doctor. Each Doctor is different, I suppose. Now, what I do wish was different by this point is, even now, please, can we get rid of the families from this show? I understand why they're there, because it adds more background to the characters that are traveling in the TARDIS. However, it does run the risk of diluting the story for the sake of soapland exposition. The only time I've ever felt like a family has truly worked in Doctor Who was when it came to Catherine Day and Donna Noble. Now, obviously, we were going to get the family in that particular Christmas special with Donna Noble because it's the runaway bride, it's a wedding. Naturally, of course, the family will be in that story. However, I always felt that Donna's family added more to the plot because of the Impossible Girl storyline than any other family ever did in Doctor Who. I know that we have Ryan and Graham, who are related by Graham's marriage to Grace, but they got rid of Grace in the first story. They bumped her off. So she has very little to do with the impact of Doctor Who, other than the fact that her departure means that Ryan and Graham need to work together on their relationship and see themselves as he's my granddad, he's my grandson, which is another thing that exposition can lend itself to. And we seem to get that in every single story. So when it comes to write for this story, though, we've got Yaz's mum, Nadia, played by Shobna Gulati, who was in Coronation Street. But in addition to that, we've also got her dad and her sister. Do we really need these characters? They didn't really add anything to the story. Obviously, we've got Shobna in the story, so you're going to have to give her something to do. But even her mum character does not add a lot to the story. I don't know. I think this is probably a weak as water argument from me in this case, because at the point where if the families aren't adding anything to the story, I just don't really see the need for them to be there. When I look back at Classic Who, Adric's brother was bumped off, Nissa's father was bumped off, Tegan's aunt was bumped off. The families never played a massive role, and I think I preferred it that way. It adds to the mystique of the companion. I don't know though, the fleshing out of companions I think is something that does work in favour of the show. The companions are obviously still our eyes into the TARDIS and our questions, so I don't think it that aspect of fleshing them out in some way needs to be cut, but the families are now at the debatable stage whether or not we really need them or not. Maybe we could go back to off-screen families, but have something like, well, a bit like what we got with Ace and her storyline. I don't think that would necessarily be a bad idea. So, whilst this review is not very long, I would say that Arachnids in the UK is very lackluster compared to the first two stories of Jodie Whittaker's, as I have already stated. I think that it needed much more of the fear factor, having the spiders play more of the role throughout without too much exposition, tap into the psychological dangers that these creatures present, and something that we experience in our everyday lives. Whilst the story doesn't need to be a two-parter, it certainly needed to focus on the more scarier aspects rather than just talking. None of that in this case is the actor's fault. The actors' performances in this overall were fine. I like the costuming, the lighting, and yes, I did complain about the CGI, but it's okay for the time period and for what it was and the budget that they had. This is all on Chibnall, really, in this case, and I give this story a 6 out of 10. It's mid at best. It's definitely watchable, but I think it just needed to play more into the fear factor a bit. Let me know what you think. Chat about it, don't chat about it. Thanks for watching. I will see you tomorrow at 4 p.m. Bye bye.